Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about album number 10 from Tangerine Dream. Tangram. Okay, so, now we've finally made it to Tangerine Dream's 80s work, 1980 to be exact. And we've hit another transitional period with this project. After going in so much of a brighter, more melodic, and more prog rock-centric approach with their previous album and finding as much success as they did by making their sound more accessible, they started to continue a little in that direction and really double down on the more straightforward melodic approach, I guess. They did also lose their new drummer, Klaus Krieger, but in his place came a new, much more permanent third member who contributed a lot more on a musical level, Johannes Schmoling. Sorry for butcher pronunciations. Who himself would stay on board for roughly as long as Peter Baumann did, appearing on all but the last two albums that I will be dedicating videos to in this series. I guess this is one of those albums that some fans might have like a bit of mixed reception on. I've seen a number of people who are really on board for this band doing their most experimental and jam session-centric material say that Force Majeure was the last album from the band that they really cared about, and this album's even more easily accessible direction, combined with its lack of a rock edge that previous album had, may have led to a bunch of shrugs from said fans. And if that is the case, I do get it. Their last several albums tended to feel like they had some kind of theme to them or a sound to them, which none of the other albums in their catalog did. And this one, in comparison, might come off rather plain to some. It's just two 20-minute compositions that are all about the bright synth melodies and pretty much nothing else. Not to mention, a lot of their old albums would often have some kind of like darker or moodier or more sinister edge to them in parts. And this album doesn't have nearly as much of that. The tone of this one is way more earnest without any attempts to really sound cool for its own sake. Also, now that we're in the 80s, they don't really have as much of the benefit of being, like, really ahead of their time either. By this point, like, Jean-Michel Jarre had shown up and delivered stuff like Oxygen and Equinox, which may as well have just been the peak of what this particular genre had to offer. And I can also, of course, see this marking a point in the band's history for some fans where everything would really start to go downhill afterwards, which I'll get into more when I talk about their next album. But even if I can see where this album's detractors might be coming from, I think the fact that I own the CD of this one kinda gives away which side of the aisle I stand on. In terms of Tangerine Dream albums where the pure personal nostalgia factor is the strongest, it is this album and the next one that hit the hardest for me by a long shot. I think this was the second Tangerine Dream album I ever heard, and I used to come back to this one and put it on all the freaking time. You can call it plain, I guess, but the way I see it, this album is probably the most pure expression of what Tangerine Dream is all about, or at least what I always came to them specifically for, without any twists or gimmicks. It's just ridiculously great melodic synth music that can near effortlessly put me in a better mood. They're still nailing that open and sprawling cosmic feel that they've always been known for with early material, but the even more accessible melodies make it even more immediately striking. Right from the very beginning, when I put this album on for the very first time and I heard those little plinking 7-note synth arpeggios, it felt like it was perfectly setting the mood that I would have had in mind when I first saw the title Tangram. It's as close as music can get to, like, evoking a puzzle made out of geometric shapes. They feel so clean and tactile, and those melodies keep fittingly rearranging themselves into new shapes, forming a new 8-note pattern around a minute in, with other minimal keyboard licks joining in do-do-do-do, and further progressing, being joined by guitars and synth choirs, really kicking into a dramatic high gear around the 3.5-minute mark, bringing the first percussion and a switch up into bassier sequences at the 4.5-minute mark, and rapidly switching into like this weird, like, Revolutionary War marching band kind of section for all of like 20 seconds, with this ridiculously cheery little whistling melodies, which I swear to God might just be the best part of the whole album. It is so weirdly charming and musically cathartic. And then these other, even more dramatic arpeggios and chords form out of that little detour, getting even more and more epic with those unaccompanied sequences and melodies alone, and even throwing in a guitar solo for good measure. This entire early stretch of the album that takes up roughly the first 7.5 minutes of Tangram Set 1, retroactively titled Wisdom and Tragedy by a 2008 re-recording, is like some of the best progressive synth material that's ever been made. It just makes me so happy. By the way, I will continue to reference those titles from the 2008 re-recording in this review, not because I feel like you should listen to it. There's really no reason to, since it's exactly the same as the original with some techno beats lazily layered on top, and as such is neither an interesting reinterpretation nor effectively recaptures the simple timelessness of the original. It's just nice to reference since it gave proper names to all the different subsections of these two tracks that intuitively make sense. Like the next section taking up the next 4 minutes or so that was retroactively titled Dragon in the House, feels like its own separate song that has a much more low-key, tender, and emotional tone than what came before. Lots of very pretty fluttering keyboards, eventually building into some of those Yes-style acoustic guitar chords, and very warm and inviting major key melodies. Well, that's more like the next 2 minutes. Like around the 10.5 minute mark, all those melodies go away for all this whooshing and tapping electronic percussion that creates this really cool, hollow-sounding subspace. Eventually building into some more minimal but dramatic synth pads, and as we cross the 13-minute mark, we enter into a new section, retroactively titled Wu Wei. Another more propulsive passage with undulating waves of bass and various synth arpeggios layering over each other that honestly pretty effectively hit a similar note to the best parts of Rubicon. Also with a few squeaky guitar solos and some big triumphant melodic riffs joining in at some points, and later even further building up with a new bass line that jumps up and down an octave and some filtered keyboards that highly resemble the intro of The Who's Won't Get Fooled Again. But all of that finally fades away into the last section, taking up the last 2 minutes or so, retroactively titled Leaving the Masters for Good, reprising those most tender and emotional melodies from the earlier part of the piece and repurposing them into an even more lonely and heartfelt ambient passage. A little section like this really reconfirms why these guys had become like in-demand film composers, since it does really feel like it's meant to underscore a tragic scene in a movie where two main characters say goodbye to each other or something like that. Tangram Set 1 really just has so many amazing ideas and pulls all of them together in such an easily investing way. It's another one of the most impressive heights of Tangerine Dream's entire history. Now, as has become maybe a little bit of a pattern with Tangerine Dream albums, the second side is not quite as interesting or investing as the first for me. Although at the very least, it's not by much if that, and Tangram Set 2 definitely explores a lot of interesting territory in its own right not touched upon by the first half. The entire first half of this side takes up a section which was retroactively titled Point of No Return by the '08 version. Although this section has a number of pretty cool evolutions and sub-subsections to it in its own right. Starting out with like 3.5 minutes of stirring ambient pads that make for one of the darkest and most foreboding sections of the album, evoking a feeling of being lost but still pressing on regardless. Eventually, some acoustic guitars come in and these other blinking bass arpeggios come in to introduce the album's most exciting rhythmic section since the beginning of set 1. Joining in with other synth chords and guitar strumming, electric guitar solos, some weird experimental choir-like noises and other strange effects floating over those continually marching bass sequences underneath. The bass goes away at one point and then just comes back in for a pretty cool build-up and payoff around the 6 and 7 minute mark, which features this bright lead synth riff acting in the same way as a guitar solo, followed by lots more actual guitar solos. The steady foundation provided by the bass line never changes throughout this entire passage, but all the different sounds and melodies and ideas coming and going really reinforce that open-ended jam session feeling that TD's earlier material could capture so well. But as we pass the 10-minute mark, that bass line slowly fades out into the beginning of a new section which was retroactively titled Dream Puzzle. First characterized by a chaotic and dissonant blend of synth pads and synth choirs that feel way more tense and suspenseful than anything that came before, and building into all sorts of weird experimental ambience and sound effects, including some that resemble human voices yelping in the background, and also some synth effect that sort of resembles like a helicopter. But that helicopter sound eventually shifts shape itself and turns into a new propulsive bass line of its own, and it kind of returns to what was the status quo of much of the first 10 minutes, just introducing more new melodies and evolutions over that foundation of a bass line. And a little before the 15-minute mark, finally fading into more dramatic synth pads that resemble the first 3 minutes of the track. Though we still have one last section left that starts around the 15.5 minute mark, retroactively titled Terracotta. The bass synths get a lot sharper and more sinister and drill-like as all these strange clouds of whooshing and bleeping sound effects join it. By the 17-minute mark, everything is faded away into a pad that, like, resembles a didgeridoo or something, and other super chaotic synth choirs overtake the track shortly after that, reminding me a lot of the Alan Parsons Project track, Total Eclipse. But eventually, a little before the 19-minute mark, some slow buzzing and clanging synth stabs bring the traditional melodies back to the forefront, and the rest of the piece just has some more melodic pads soloing over that slower foundation for a minor key finish as everything fades out in the last moments. Now that I've really thought over it, I'm not really sure why Tangram Set 2 doesn't appeal more to fans of their earlier material with Peter Baumann still on board. I suppose it may not be as openly abstract or experimental, but it still very much captures a lot of the same vibes and doesn't feel as structured or specifically planned out as the first side was. As mentioned before, it has a lot more of that open-ended jam session feel that so many fans have gone out of their way to praise in the past, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be able to get into this as well. But I really like both sides and think they complement each other very well. I have been sitting with Tangram as a whole for a bit longer than I have for some of the other videos in this series, thanks to those big Chemical Brothers and Coan sound reviews I had to get out of the way first. But the longer I've sat with this album, the more it reconfirmed my feelings that this is one of my absolute favorite Tangerine Dream albums and one of my favorite albums to come out of any of the big 70s synth pioneers. It's at least on par with something like Jean-Michel Jarre's Equinox for me, even if perhaps getting to that level in its own different way. And heck, you know how in my Force Majeure review I mentioned that Phil Hartnell recommended that album as an effective starting point to get into the band? I feel like this might be an even more effective starting point. It's just as exciting a listen, at least for me, while much better exemplifying the kind of sound that you can only get from Tangerine Dream, and really cluing you in as to what they've always been about. There is definitely some nostalgia bias for me here that I do have to admit to, and I can certainly understand why it might not be as meaningful to other fans as it might have been for me, but as far as I'm concerned, if you're a fan of this entire progressive synth genre, this is an absolutely essential listen, and there's only one or maybe two other albums in their catalog that can top it in my eyes. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.